Okay, how's it going, guys? We're gonna go over um, what is called a mechanistic explanation. But before we can go over what is a mechanistic explanation, so let's. By the way, I don't know how to spell mechanistic explanations. So we're gonna go over the basic concept of mechanistic explanation. But this is the newer model of explanation, scientific explanation. But before we can go over this this newer model of scientific explanation, we have to look at what's the long-held dominant old model of scientific explanation. So the very old model of scientific explanation is called the, the deductive nomological model explanation. So the old model of explanation is called the deductive nomological model of explanation of explanation. By the way, when I talk about explanation, I'm talking about scientific explanation. So this is really about the philosophy of explanation or scientific explanation. It has a basic idea for this model is that you subsume a phenomenon under a general law. So takeaway is that you subsum, subsumption of a uh, phenomenon under a general law. Okay, so there are two components of it. What do we mean by subsumption of a phenomenon? What do we mean by general law? Um, so generally speaking, you know, for when you try to explain something in the DN model, you first have to know what you're trying to explain. First, then you have to figure out, well, what is a general law that subsumes the phenomenon? What is a general law that covers the phenomenon in question? And what is the initial condition that we have here? And with the initial conditions and the general law, you deduce the phenomenon you're trying to explain. Um, so, for example, examples of this is consider how do we explain, um, you know, exp we want to explain water boiling at a pan, like everyone that's cooking, right? You can boil water in a pan, right? If we want to explain that, like, how do we explain the boiling of water at a pan? So first I have to kind of um, figure out what the general law is. So the general law in this case would be, well, general law would be um, typically water, okay, boil at, let's say, at 100 Celsius in standard atmospheric pressure. Atmospheric pressure. Okay. So this is our general law. What are my initial conditions? Initial conditions would be the pan right now. The pan is currently at atmospheric pressure and it's currently being heated up to 100 and is currently being heated up to 100 Celsius. So combining the general law, which is water is boils at 100 Celsius in standard atmospheric pressure, and the initial condition, which is conditions of my pen right now. Like the pen is at atmospheric pressure and it's currently being heated up to 100 Celsius. Given these two propositions, right, we could derive what we what we want to explain, which is water boils at a pen, right? So this is what given given the general law plus the initial condition, right? We we can explain water boils at a pan. Okay, so this is how the DN model work. This is how the DN model of explanation or scientific explanation kind of work. But the problem with this model, right, is that this model doesn't really help us when it comes to the special sciences. Like it doesn't help us with, like, let's say, explaining phenomenon in biology or neuroscience. So the DN model really sucks at explaining explaining phenomenon in the special sciences, like biology and neuroscience. So how do you spell neuroscience? N-E-U, neuroscience. Okay. So there are problems or inadequacy with the DN model. So what we not want is to find an alternative. Like we need a kind of a good alternative to the dominant DN model of scientific explanation. So there is a need for an alternative to the DN model. Okay, so the mechanistic model of explanation or the mechanistic model of scientific explanation really are inspired by biology. So one have to think about, well, how does explanation in biology works? And typically it involves um, explaining how a mechanism kind of works, right? Um, so the mechanistic approach, so the mechanistic approach to scientific explanation is this. Okay. Um, so there are three components to a mechanistic explanation. The first component is basically, reduce a system to its parts or components of a system. So we want to analyze the system. So we want to analyze a system, and we want to be able to break the system into parts or components of a system. So parts, components of a system. So you can think about, well, initially you have, let's say you have a system, let's represented by this. Then you break it up into parts, right? Now you have, a set of little tiny little components that compose the system. Okay, let's say this is the P1. Um, the second part component of a mechanistic approach to scientific explanation is, okay, identifying the operations and processes of these parts. Okay, identify operations or processes uh, of parts and components, of course. Um, so you can think about, you know, mm, so there are these, so so you have operations, processes, but let's suppose that you reduce these, a system to set of operations or processes. Let's denote operation one by O sub one, O sub two, O sub three, O sub four, etc. Um, and then the third part is to identify the organization of the system, or try to give a maybe initial organization of the system. You know, organization of a system, or maybe how the system is put together, or how the components of the parts of the system come together to form the system itself. So we're looking at organization of the system, or maybe in this case, mapping the parts and or the components to the operations. Mapping the parts slash components to the operations. So now imagine that these are our parts. Let's say P1, P2, P3, etc. These are our operations or slash processes, O1, O2, O3, dot, dot, dot. So we want to maybe map each of the parts of the system to the operation. So maybe part one is connected to operation O2. Part two is connected to or mapped to operation O1. Um, well, part three is mapped to operation O3, for example. So by mapping each of the parts with each of the operations and processes, you in some sense articulate the structure of the organization of the system. So so this is the really the basics, the ontology or of how mechanistic approach to scientific explanation works. So you look at a system, you break the system into parts or components of a system, right? You have a whole system and you break it into parts, right, of the system. And then you identify these operations or processes of how the system works. So we call these, operations and processes. We denote each of these operations processes by O1, O2, O3, O4, etc. And then we state the organization of the system. And this typically involves mapping of the parts or components of the system to these operations. So we have the parts on one side, and then we have the operations and processes on the other side. And we are mapping the parts to the operations. And that's typically how a mechanistic explanation works. Um, to give an example, um, um, so how does so suppose that someone want to explain how why blood circulate. Um, how does blood circulate throughout the entire body? How does blood circulate through throughout the body, right? Um, so what are some of the components, right? So like we want to look at the parts. Parts. The parts would be the right atrium, atrium, the left atrium, the right ven, ven, ventricles, um, and the left ventricle. So, and then you also have, so it's really complicated. Biology is so complicated. And you have valves, like you have one-way valves, like the tricuspid. You have the mitral. You have the plum, plummery, and then you have a aortic. So these are the parts of the system. Um, so let's look at the operations, the operations or the processes, if you want to say that. So you could say, so, so, the chamber. So let's say the first operation would be the chamber contracts and relax, right? And then the valves, or these are the valves, by the way, like these are the valves, valves. These are the, by the way, these are the chambers. These are the chambers. Chambers. Explanation in biology is complicated. I know. Um, yeah, yeah. So the chambers contract and relax, right? And the valves open uh, to let blood in, to let blood through, and close to block it, and close to block it from flowing backward. Okay. So you have the chamber that is contracting and relaxing. You have the valves that open and let the blood through and close to block it from flowing backwards. So given the parts and given the organizations, now we really are trying to map the parts with the operations to give the explanation, right? So the way the organization works, um, organization, how the parts and how the parts and the operations are arranged, it would be something like the blood flows in one way, but flows in one way. So you have um, you veins, right? Leads and the blood goes from the veins to the right atrium, right? And then through the tricuspid valve. Um, so remember, a valve opens and let blood through and close to block it from flowing back. Okay, to the tricuspid valve, uh, and then to the right ventricle. Uh, chamber. So remember, a chamber contracts and relaxes. So the blood goes to right ventricle. Okay, and then goes to the pulmonary, plumber, pulmonary valve, and then it goes to the lungs and goes to the left atrium, and then goes to the mitral valve, and then to the left. Okay, this is getting longer. So there is this whole set of processes that start, the blood starts from the vein and all the way to a whole bunch of processes that ends with the veins again. All right. I'm not going to go to the entire process because it's kind of long. Okay. So, and this is kind of an explanation why blood flows in one way or why blood circulate, because like you start off in the veins and you end up in the veins again, and it goes in one way. Um, yeah, so that's an explanation of how mechanistic explanation works. You first you break up a system into its parts, right? And you label it P1, P2 example, and then you identify the processes and operations of the system, and then you map the parts and the operations, right? We give an example of it. How do you explain how blood flow circulate through the body, or how blood circulate throughout the body? It's kind of a complicated example, but that's how it works in biology. You kind of look at the system through its parts. What are the parts involved? So in this case, these are the chambers and the valves. And then you have, well, what are the operation processes? Well, you have the chambers that contract and relax, and you have the valves that open and let blood through and close to block it from flowing backwards. And then you have the operation, that really explain the phenomenon of why blood, circulate. Where blood flows in one way, you start the blood from the veins and you go to the right atrium and then blah blah blah, all the way to the veins again, and you can see kind of how the blood flows in one way. Um, yeah, yeah, okay, but that's it. Subscribe if you're like interested in this kind of nerdy stuff.